Alexander Donovan, a name once associated with boundless power and influence, was now whispered in hushed, skeptical tones across boardrooms and newsrooms alike. Just a few years prior, he was untouchable, a visionary who had carved an empire from the ground up, building Donovan Industries into a giant whose reach extended into sectors from technology to finance. People revered him, envied him, and, to his secret satisfaction, feared him. But all of that had been shattered in the blink of an eye. The scandal broke on an unassuming Wednesday afternoon, when Alexander's financial advisor sent an encrypted message to his personal email. Alexander read it twice, then a third time, his usually sharp mind slow to process what he was seeing. Decades of work unraveled in a matter of minutes. Within days, media outlets blared headlines that tore his reputation apart, linking him to fraudulent dealings, hidden accounts, and under-the-table partnerships that left even his closest allies stunned. Alexander's inner circle crumbled quickly. Associates he'd trusted for years abandoned him to save themselves. His power dissolved as rapidly as his assets, forcing him to resign. His wife, Catherine, whom he had loved deeply in his own reserved way, stood by him, but the strain was too much. Just months after the scandal, she passed away unexpectedly. A heart attack, the doctor said, though Alexander suspected her heart had simply given out from the shame and heartbreak. Now, alone in the cavernous Donovan estate, a shell of his former self, Alexander roamed room to room, memories swirling like ghosts he couldn't shake. At night, shadows danced across the walls, their movements unsettling. In the quietest hours, he would feel his hands tremble, an unwelcome reminder of the illness creeping into his life. The diagnosis was vague, something neurological, the doctors explained, but it could be years before its full toll became clear. They urged him to rest, to avoid stress. But how could he escape stress when it gnawed at his mind every waking hour? The once celebrated Alexander Donovan was now a prisoner of his own body, his own home, and his own regrets. The following morning, Alexander woke in the faint, muted light of dawn, casting a gray hue over the grand but empty Donovan estate. He sat up slowly, his gaze falling on the expansive view from his bedroom window. The glassy surface of the lake, once a daily source of joy for him and Catherine, now reflected only loneliness. In a strange mix of longing and desperation, Alexander decided he needed to leave the estate, if only for a little while. He needed to feel something other than the creeping isolation. After changing into a worn jacket, he left the mansion, his car rolling down the winding driveway toward the city. He hadn't done this in years, just go out on a whim, without an agenda, without someone waiting for him. He found himself drawn toward Central Park, the same place he and Catherine used to take their young son, Nicholas, on lazy weekend afternoons. Those visits felt like lifetimes ago, back when Nicholas would chase after his mother, laughing as she called out to him, warning him not to wander too far. Alexander had always hung back, watching with a quiet pride. Those moments had once seemed simple, ordinary. Now, they felt like precious fragments, slipping away even as he tried to remember them clearly. As he walked the paths of Central Park, memories surfaced with each step. He recalled Nicholas's small hand slipping into his own as they crossed the wooden bridges, Catherine's laughter as she tossed breadcrumbs to the birds. He could almost feel them beside him again, ghosts conjured by his guilt and grief. The emptiness tightened his throat, and he found himself wandering further from the main trails, avoiding the clusters of people and families that reminded him of all he had lost. Eventually, he found a quiet bench tucked away beneath the branches of a sprawling oak tree. The early morning crowd passed him by, indifferent, which was exactly what he wanted. Alexander lowered himself onto the bench and let his thoughts drift. As he sat there, he noticed an elderly couple across the path, smiling and talking as if nothing else existed. He watched them, half envious, half nostalgic. For a moment, he felt a pang of yearning so strong it nearly took his breath away. He missed Catherine terribly, in a way he could never have anticipated. She had been his grounding force, the one person who could see past his exterior to whatever scraps of goodness he'd managed to salvage for her alone. But in the end, he had failed even her. lost in the spiraling ambition that had ultimately cost him everything. Hours passed without his notice, the sounds of the park lulling him into a quiet, almost numb state. Here, amidst the chattering birds and distant laughter of strangers, Alexander Donovan began to confront the reality of his fall. Not just the financial ruin or public disgrace, but the loss of a family, a life, and perhaps even a part of his own humanity. The early afternoon sun was dipping through the trees as Alexander sat on the bench, lost in thought, when a soft, haunting melody drifted through the park. It was faint at first, a few notes carried on the breeze, but it grew louder, winding its way through the quiet corners of the path until it reached him. The music was beautiful, yet lonely, a kind of yearning that tugged at something buried deep inside him. Curious, Alexander rose slowly, following the sound as if pulled by an invisible thread. Just a short distance from his secluded bench, he spotted her. A young woman playing the violin with her eyes closed, her face a mixture of concentration and passion. Her worn coat, the delicate way her fingers moved over the strings, the resilience in her posture, it all captured his attention. She played with a conviction that seemed to bleed from her soul, and he found himself mesmerized, his own troubles momentarily forgotten. She finished her piece, the last note hanging in the air like a whisper before she opened her eyes and saw him standing there. She offered a faint, almost shy smile, as if enthused to having an audience. "That was stunning," he said, his voice rough from hours of silence. The young woman gave a small nod of gratitude. "Thank you. I don't usually have anyone listening." "I can't imagine why not," he replied, his eyes not leaving her. "You play as if the music is part of you." She seemed taken aback by his comment, but nodded again. "It is. I started playing when I was young. It's always been the only constant in my life." Alexander saw a glimmer of something familiar in her expression. Pain, perhaps, or loss. It was hard to tell. He suddenly wanted to know more about her, this young woman with the haunting melody and the sad eyes. But before he could ask, a sudden commotion erupted nearby. Shouts broke through the tranquility of the park, followed by the sharp sound of a scuffle. Two men had appeared from behind the trees, their eyes fixed on the violinist with a predatory intent that sent a chill down Alexander's spine. One of them, a tall man with a scar over his cheek, was moving toward her with an outstretched hand, while the other circled around her, cutting off her path of escape. Alexander could see the fear in her eyes as she clutched her violin tightly, taking a step back. "Hey!" Alexander's voice boomed louder than he expected, surprising himself. The men looked over, sizing him up, and one of them sneered, taking another step toward her. "Mind your own business, old man," the scarred one growled. But Alexander was already moving. He hadn't thrown a punch in decades, hadn't been in any kind of physical confrontation since his younger years, yet some dormant instinct kicked in. He planted himself between the violinist and the men, his body rigid, his heart pounding in his chest. "Leave her alone," he said, a firmness in his voice he hadn't felt in years. The men exchanged glances, clearly evaluating him. Alexander could feel the weight of their gaze, but he held his ground. He didn't flinch when the scarred man stepped closer, his eyes narrowed. For a tense moment, it seemed like the man would press forward, but something in Alexander's gaze made him hesitate. "Tisich," the man spat on the ground, glaring. "She's not worth the trouble." With a final disdainful glance, the two men backed away, retreating into the park's shadows. Alexander stood there, tense, waiting until he was sure they were gone. When he finally turned back to the young woman, her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she hugged her violin close to her chest. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded slowly, trying to regain her composure. I think so. I didn't expect anyone to thank you. I didn't even know you, and you just..." He gave her a faint, reassuring smile. No one should have to face that alone. He looked away, uncomfortable under her gaze, unsure of what to say next. But to his surprise, she spoke again. "Rosie. My name is Rosie," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Alexander," he replied, extending a hand, which she shook with a gentle grip. For a moment, they stood in an unspoken understanding, both caught in the unexpected moment. They found themselves walking side by side along the park's winding path, a slow, comfortable silence lingering between them. Rosie occasionally glanced at Alexander, her expression a mix of curiosity and quiet gratitude. He could tell she was still shaken, but she held herself with a resilience that reminded him of someone he once knew, someone he couldn't quite bring to mind. After a while, Rosie broke the silence. "Thank you again for what you did back there. Most people would have just looked the other way." She paused, glancing down as if ashamed of something. "It's not the first time those kinds of things happen. I guess I'm used to it by now." Alexander shook his head. "You shouldn't have to get used to things like that. People can be cruel." "Yeah," she murmured, her gaze distant. "Cruel is about right." For a moment, her voice held a hint of bitterness, and he wondered what had brought someone so young to such a point. "But I don't want to think about that today." They walked a bit further, the conversation hesitant and tentative, until they reached a quiet grove, where a wooden bridge stretched over a small, still pond. Rosie paused, leaning against the rail and looking over the water. Alexander stopped beside her, watching her reflection in the pond. She looked tired in a way that felt too familiar, a kind of weary acceptance of life's weight that he knew all too well. Rosie looked up, as if reading his thoughts. "So, Alexander, what brings you to the park today?" Alexander hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He hadn't intended to share anything personal, but her eyes held a kindness that made him feel oddly safe, like she wouldn't judge him no matter what he said. He cleared his throat, searching for words he hadn't spoken aloud before. "Truthfully, I don't know," he began, his voice low. "I suppose I was looking for something I lost a long time ago." He glanced away, embarrassed by the vague answer, but Rosie nodded as if she understood. "People come here to find things all the time," she said softly. "It's kind of why I come here too. My dad used to bring me here when I was a kid. Just the two of us." Alexander noticed the way her expression shifted at the mention of her father, a flicker of pain that she quickly tried to hide. But he caught it. "Do you see him much?" he asked gently. Rosie's lips pressed into a thin line. "No. He left when I was young." She looked down, her fingers absent-mindedly brushing the edge of her violin case. "I don't really know why. All I have left of him is this." She reached under her shirt and pulled out a small pendant hanging on a thin silver chain. It was a simple thing, a tiny rose made of red glass, its petals delicate and worn from years of handling. Alexander studied it, feeling a pang of recognition he couldn't place. Something about the pendant stirred a strange familiarity, but he quickly brushed the thought aside. "It's beautiful," he said, genuinely moved. "And it suits you, Rosie." She smiled faintly, her fingers closing around the rose. "I've never taken it off, even though he never came back. It's strange, isn't it? Holding on to things like this." "Not strange at all," Alexander replied quietly. "Sometimes memories are all we have left to remind us of the good things." He felt a weight in his chest as he spoke, a heaviness that had been growing in him for years. She tilted her head, studying him in a way that felt almost piercing. "You've lost someone too, haven't you?" The question struck him like a blow, unexpected and painful. He swallowed hard, his mind flashing back to images of Catherine, of Nicholas when he was just a boy. "Yes," he managed, his voice rough. "My wife, my son, they're both gone." A deep silence settled between them. Rosie nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Loss, it changes us, doesn't it?" Alexander felt the familiar ache in his heart, one that never truly faded. "It does. It makes you feel like you're a different person, like a part of you left with them." Rosie glanced at him thoughtfully, a gentleness in her gaze. "Maybe that's why we come to places like this, to find the parts of ourselves we thought we lost." He looked at her, surprised by the insight of her words. For a young woman, she seemed to carry a wisdom that went beyond her years. Alexander felt a strange sense of kinship with her, as if they were both wandering souls who had been brought together by a twist of fate. They stayed by the pond, neither speaking, just letting the quiet fill the gaps between them. For Alexander, it was the first time in a long while that he felt a sense of peace, a small respite from the storm inside him. After some time, Rosie cleared her throat, as if hesitant to break the calm. "You know, when I play," she said softly, "it feels like I'm talking to someone, like I'm reaching out to whoever might be listening." She looked up at him with a shy smile. "Maybe that sounds silly." "Not at all," Alexander replied, shaking his head. "Sometimes music can say what words can't. Maybe that's why I was so drawn to it, to you." Rosie's cheeks flushed, and she looked away, her fingers toying with the strap of her violin case. "I don't usually meet people who get it. Most people just pass by without noticing. Then most people don't know what they're missing," he said quietly, meaning it more than he could convey. They both knew it was time to part ways, but neither moved. There was something binding in their exchange, a silent promise of understanding. Finally, Rosie lifted her violin case, ready to leave. But before she did, she looked back at him. "Will you come tomorrow?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "I mean, I'll be here if you want to talk more." He nodded, feeling a strange warmth in her invitation, something that he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose, even if he didn't fully understand it. "I'll be here," he promised, watching as she walked away, her figure slowly blending into the shadows of the trees. And for the first time in years, Alexander felt a sliver of hope piercing through the darkness, something fragile and small, but real. Alexander spent the night restlessly, haunted by the strange sense of familiarity he had felt around Rosie. Her music, her quiet strength, the way she spoke about her father and the pendant. It stirred something unsettling in him, something he couldn't quite grasp. He sat awake, his mind drifting to the past, to faces and memories he thought he had buried. The next day, as promised, Alexander returned to Central Park. He felt a mixture of anticipation and curiosity, wondering if Rosie would truly be there. As he walked the same winding path, the day bright and warm with the early autumn sun, he finally heard the familiar strains of her violin floating through the air, pulling him toward her once more. Rosie was in her usual spot, her eyes closed as she played. This time, the music had a softer, more hopeful sound. Her expression was one of serenity, as though in these moments, she found a peace that eluded her otherwise. When she finished, she opened her eyes and saw him standing there, and her face lit up with a small, genuine smile. "You came back?" she said, a touch of surprise in her voice. Alexander nodded, feeling oddly self-conscious under her gaze. "Of course. I wanted to hear you play again. You're very talented, Rosie." She flushed slightly, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Thank you. It's one of the few things I feel like I'm truly good at." They settled onto the same bench from the day before, and as they sat in the shade of the trees, Rosie began to share more of her life. She told him about the hardships of making ends meet, about how she'd been on her own for years, working late nights, struggling to pay for her music lessons. She explained how she'd taken up street performing not just to earn extra money, but to keep her music alive, to make sure she wouldn't lose the only connection she felt she still had to her father. "I always thought he'd come back one day," she said, looking down at her hands. "I imagined he'd just show up out of nowhere and explain why he left. I spent years waiting, hoping, but now I don't think he ever will." She laughed bitterly, but there was a hint of vulnerability in her voice that touched Alexander deeply. "I mean, I don't even know where he is, if he's alive, or if he even remembers I exist." Alexander felt a pang of sympathy, his own memories of Nicholas flashing through his mind. He knew all too well the pain of distance, the ache of wondering if the people you've lost even think of you. But something about her story gnawed at him, a nagging thought that he couldn't quite shake. "Rosie, you said you only have the pendant left of him?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. She nodded, reaching up to touch it again, as if it brought her comfort. "Yes, I found it in his things after he left. I don't remember much else about him, just fragments. But this, it's been with me since I was a kid." She looked up at Alexander with a small, sad smile. "It's silly, but I like to think he gave it to me on purpose, like a piece of him he wanted me to keep. Alexander's mind began to spin. He glanced at the pendant again, its delicate rose shape glinting in the sunlight. He couldn't explain it, but there was a growing certainty that he had seen something like it before. He felt an urgency, a need to understand this connection between them. It was as though pieces of a puzzle were starting to fall into place, yet there was still so much missing. Rosie, he began slowly, measuring his words. I don't mean to pry, but would it be all right if I looked into this? I have some resources that might help us find out what happened to your father. She looked at him, surprise in her eyes. You'd do that? Why? He hesitated, searching for an answer. How could he explain the strange pull he felt, the sense that this wasn't just a random encounter? He finally settled on the truth. Because I think we both deserve answers. Sometimes, things don't make sense until we dig a little deeper. She considered this, her fingers brushing the pendant absently. I don't even know where you'd start, she admitted softly. I don't have anything. No photos, no letters, just memories that are too faded to piece together. Let me worry about that, he said, his voice firm but reassuring. He wanted her to feel a sense of hope, a sense that perhaps someone could finally help her find the answers she had been seeking. A hint of relief appeared in her expression, mixed with cautious optimism. All right, she said finally. I trust you, Alexander. They sat in silence, a quiet understanding passing between them. Alexander felt something settle within him, a determination he hadn't felt in years. For once, he wasn't just thinking of his own pain, his own regret, Rosie's search for her father, her quiet resilience. It gave him a purpose, a reason to dig into the past that he had spent so long trying to forget. After they parted that day, Alexander returned to his empty home, his mind buzzing with the beginnings of a plan. He still had contacts, even if they had grown distant, and resources that could unlock doors and reveal things most people couldn't find. He made a few calls, using a secure line he hadn't touched in years, and explained his request in vague terms. As he hung up the phone, he sat back, a rare glimmer of hope flickering in him. He didn't know what he would find, or if any of this would lead to answers, but for the first time since Catherine's death, since Nicholas's tragic passing, he felt a sense of purpose. Something outside of himself, something that, perhaps, he could help set right. The thought of it filled the empty spaces within him, and for the first time in years, Alexander Donovan felt a flicker of life begin to return. Days turned into weeks as Alexander dug deeper into Rosie's past, each new piece of information drawing him further into a web of memories he'd tried to bury. He felt the strange connection between them intensify, an invisible thread pulling him back to moments he had long since hidden away. He couldn't bring himself to tell her everything, not until he knew for certain. One afternoon, as he sat in his study surrounded by dusty files and old contacts, a manila envelope arrived, delivered by a private investigator he'd hired. Alexander's hands shook as he opened it, each sheet of paper a step further into a truth he hadn't been prepared to confront. Inside were the records, names, dates, documents that pointed to something he couldn't deny. Rosie was indeed connected to him, connected in a way that took his breath away. She was Nicholas's daughter, the granddaughter he had never known he had. Nicholas, his only son, who had died so young and so tragically, had left a part of himself behind. Alexander felt a painful pang of realization as he held the papers, his vision blurring slightly. He had missed so much. He had failed to protect not only his son, but also the family he'd left behind. Alexander sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. In that quiet moment, fragments of Nicholas's life flooded his mind. The laughter, the arguments, the silences that had grown between them as Nicholas became an adult and drifted further from his father. Alexander had been so wrapped up in building his empire that he hadn't noticed how distant his son had become, hadn't seen the signs of his loneliness. And now, looking at the evidence in his hands, he realized he had been given a second chance, however painful, to do something right. But he also knew he couldn't keep this truth to himself, not for long. Rosie deserved to know. The thought of telling her made him feel vulnerable in a way he hadn't in years. How could he explain to her the years of neglect, the mistakes that had created a chasm between him and Nicholas, the lost opportunities to make things right? When he met Rosie that evening at their usual spot in the park, his heart was heavy, his thoughts racing. She was there, waiting for him, her violin case resting on her lap as she gave him a warm, welcoming smile. She looked so young, so hopeful, and the knowledge of who she truly was made Alexander's heart ache even more. They sat on the bench, and Rosie sensed his unusual quiet. "Is everything all right, Alexander?" she asked, her gaze concerned as she studied his expression. He took a deep breath, struggling to find the words. "Rosie, I need to tell you something. It's complicated." Her expression shifted, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "All right," she replied softly. "You can tell me." For a moment, Alexander stared down at his hands, gathering the strength to continue. "I've been looking into your family, as I promised," he began, his voice low. "I found out more than I ever expected, more than I think either of us were prepared for." She leaned forward, her eyes wide, searching his face for any hint of what he was about to say. "What did you find?" He took another deep breath. "Rosie, your father, Nicholas, he was my son." He forced himself to meet her gaze, watching the initial shock settle into her eyes, her expression frozen with disbelief. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Your son?" Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of his past mistakes sink deeper into him. "I didn't know," he said, his voice laced with regret. "I didn't know he had a daughter. I didn't know about you." Rosie's hands covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears as she tried to process what he had just revealed. She looked away, staring at the ground, her shoulders tense as if absorbing the impact of the truth. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence thick with emotion. How could you not know?" she asked finally, her voice trembling. Didn't you care about him? Didn't you keep in touch?" The question cut through him, raw and painful. He wanted to explain, to justify himself, but he knew there were no excuses that could mend the years of separation. "I failed him, Rosie," he admitted quietly. "I was too consumed with my work, with building my own legacy. I thought I was doing it for him, for our family, but I see now that I pushed him away." He looked down, shame flooding him, and in the end, he felt he couldn't come to me. "I lost him because of my own mistakes." Rosie wiped a tear from her cheek, her expression shifting between anger and sadness. "So, all this time, you've been right here, but you never knew? You never looked for him? For me?" Her words hit him with the force of a lifetime of regret. He had missed so much. Her childhood, her laughter, her first steps into music. He had been oblivious, and now, here she was, carrying the weight of her father's absence without ever knowing her family had been just within reach. "I didn't know," he repeated, his voice breaking. If I had known, things would have been different. I would have been there. I would have." But the words sounded hollow, even to him. Nothing he could say would change the years of hurt and loss she had endured alone. Rosie shook her head, her gaze hardening. "I've spent my whole life wondering why he left, feeling like I wasn't worth staying for. And now, you're telling me I had family all along?" Her voice rose, thick with pain. "That you were here, while I grew up thinking I was alone?" Alexander reached out, but she pulled back, wrapping her arms protectively around herself. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Rosie," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "But please, let me try to make it right. I can't change the past, but I want to be here for you now, however you'll let me." She looked at him, her gaze piercing, searching for sincerity in his face. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why care now, when it's already too late?" "Because," Alexander struggled to hold her gaze. "Because you're my family. You're all I have left. And whether or not I deserve a second chance, I want to try. I want to know you, Rosie." She looked away, her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of her emotions had finally overtaken her. Alexander sat beside her, the silence thick and raw. He knew this wasn't something he could fix in a single conversation. He had decades of mistakes to atone for, and no amount of words could erase that pain. But he felt a spark of hope, however fragile, that perhaps in time, she might allow him into her life. Rosie finally stood, clutching her violin case. "I need time, Alexander. This is too much." He nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere." Without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing down the path, leaving Alexander alone in the quiet of the park. He watched her go, feeling the crushing weight of regret and loss, but also the faintest glimmer of hope. This time, he wouldn't walk away. No matter how long it took, he would be here, waiting, hoping she might one day see him not just as the man who failed her father, but as someone who could finally be there for her. As dusk fell over the park, Alexander sat in silence, the first step toward redemption feeling as uncertain and raw as he had feared. But he would wait. For Rosie, he would wait as long as it took. The days that followed were quiet and tense. Alexander returned to the park every day, hopeful, wondering if Rosie would come back, if she would give him the chance to explain himself, to repair what he could. But each day ended with him walking away alone, a hollow ache gnawing at his chest. It was a strange, humbling sensation for him. The waiting, the hoping, the utter lack of control. In all his years of business, he'd been the one calling the shots, dictating terms. Now, he found himself in a place of vulnerability, his future with his only family resting entirely in Rosie's hands. It was almost a week later, on a chilly, overcast afternoon, that he finally saw her again. Rosie appeared along the path, her gaze hesitant as she approached, clutching her violin case tightly. Alexander's heart raced as he rose to greet her, but he restrained himself, giving her the space he knew she needed. They sat down without a word, side by side on the old wooden bench, both looking out over the pond as the wind rustled through the trees. Alexander felt the tension, thick and unyielding, and he knew she was struggling with the weight of everything he'd revealed. After a long silence, Rosie finally spoke, her voice low, edged with frustration. "I don't know what to do with all this, Alexander. You're telling me that you're my grandfather. That my whole life. You were here, and I never knew." She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting a deep hurt. "I feel like my entire world has shifted, but nothing feels any clearer." Alexander took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I can't change what happened, Rosie. I know that. I know I can't undo the years of loss and confusion you've been through. But I want to be here for you now, if you'll let me." She looked away, her fingers gripping the edge of the bench tightly. "Do you have any idea what it's like, growing up thinking you're all alone? That no one cares enough to look for you, to find you?" Her voice cracked, her shoulders trembling as she tried to keep her composure. "And now you tell me you were just here, all along?" He felt her pain acutely, each word hitting him with the weight of his own regrets. He had let so much slip through his fingers, lost so much in his blind pursuit of power and status. He wanted to reach out, to hold her hand, to comfort her, but he knew he had no right to expect that from her. "Rosie," he said gently, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to want me in your life. I want you to know that I'll do whatever it takes to make things right, as much as I can. You're my family, and that means more to me now than anything else ever has." She let out a heavy sigh, her gaze fixed on the pond as she processed his words. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the sounds of the park around them, a distant hum that seemed to fade as they both grappled with the weight of the past. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "What was he like?" she asked, surprising him. "My father. What was Nicholas like?" Alexander felt a lump in his throat. Memories of Nicholas, both bitter and sweet, surfaced in his mind. Nicholas, he was kind, compassionate, a bit stubborn, like his mother. He gave a small, sad smile. "He had a way of seeing the world that I never quite understood. Where I saw challenges, he saw beauty. Where I saw competition, he saw people. He loved music too. Maybe that's where you get it." Rosie listened intently, her expression softening slightly as she took in his words. "I always wondered," she murmured, There was so much I didn't know about him. So much I wanted to ask, to understand. He loved you, Rosie, Alexander said, his voice breaking slightly. I didn't know about you, but I know him well enough to say that he would have loved you more than anything. He would have wanted you to be happy, to follow your dreams. She nodded, a small, sad smile playing at the corners of her lips. Sometimes I think I can almost remember him. Little things, like how he'd hum to himself when he thought no one was listening, or the way he'd ruffle my hair when I was upset. She let out a shaky breath, her eyes glistening. I never thought I'd hear about him from you. Alexander felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to offer her some tangible comfort, but he restrained himself. He knew that trust would take time, that he couldn't rush her forgiveness or acceptance. If there's anything else you want to know, anything at all, I'll tell you. I want you to know him, as much as I can help you remember. Rosie nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the pond, her expression lost in thought. After a long silence, she finally turned back to him, her gaze steady and unwavering. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said, her voice firm but not unkind. There's a lot of pain there, a lot of things I don't think I'll ever understand. But maybe I don't want to be alone anymore. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and full of meaning. Alexander felt a swell of hope, tentative but real, as he looked into her eyes. You don't have to be alone, Rosie. I'm here, and I'll be here as long as you want me to be. She nodded, her expression softening just a little, a sign that, maybe, there was a chance for something new to grow between them. I'd like to know more, she said quietly, almost as if to herself. About him, about all of it. They sat in silence after that, a kind of understanding forming between them that didn't need words. For Alexander, it was the beginning of something he had never thought he would have. A second chance, a way to make amends, however late. And for Rosie, it was the start of a journey to reclaim a piece of herself that had always been missing. As the sun began to set over the park, casting long shadows across the pond, Alexander felt a sense of peace settle over him, a peace he hadn't known in years. He had a long way to go, many wounds to heal, but in that quiet moment, he felt the first fragile tendrils of forgiveness beginning to take root. And for the first time, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could both find a way forward, together. As autumn deepened, Alexander and Rosie settled into an unspoken rhythm of meeting in the park. They would sit on their familiar bench, talking about the past, sharing small memories of Nicholas that gradually came to light. The conversations were tentative at first, both of them careful not to dig too deeply or touch upon raw nerves. But day by day, a fragile bond began to take shape. One afternoon, as golden leaves drifted lazily around them, Rosie looked over at Alexander, her expression thoughtful. You know, I've been thinking about my childhood, she said quietly. How many questions I had that never got answered. I always felt like I was searching for something. I just never knew it was you. She paused, her gaze softening. And I think that's why I kept coming back. Even when I wanted to be angry, to walk away. Something kept bringing me back here. To you. Alexander felt a pang of guilt, but also a strange sense of relief. He had come to expect the tension between them, the unspoken grievances, and now hearing her speak with this openness was a sign that perhaps she was beginning to let go of some of the hurt. He nodded, choosing his words carefully. I know I failed you in ways I'll never be able to fully make up for, Rosie. But having you here, it's giving me a chance to understand what I missed. Who I missed. She studied his face, her expression difficult to read. It's strange, isn't it? She murmured. In some ways, you're a stranger, and in other ways, it's like, I already know you. The words struck Alexander deeply. He reached out slowly, placing his hand over hers on the bench, and this time, she didn't pull away. They sat like that for a moment, the quiet warmth of the gesture speaking volumes that words could not. He could feel the pulse of something growing between them, a cautious hope, a shared grief, a recognition of family that went beyond explanations or apologies. As the weeks passed, their conversations deepened. Rosie would sometimes bring her violin, and she'd play a song or two. each note seeming to pull Alexander closer to his memories of Nicholas. Each melody a reminder of the family he had almost forgotten how to mourn. She played with a depth of emotion that left him speechless, and in those moments, he saw not only his granddaughter but the son he had lost too soon. One evening, as the air turned brisk and the shadows grew longer, Rosie hesitated before putting her violin back in its case. She looked over at him, her brow furrowed. "Alexander, I've been wondering about something." Her voice was hesitant, as if she feared she might be crossing a line. "Go ahead, Rosie," he encouraged, sensing her apprehension. "It's just, I know you've changed since we first met. I can see it. But there's still so much I don't understand." She paused, searching his face. "Why did you choose your career over family? What drove you to leave so much behind?" The question hung heavily in the air, but Alexander nodded, knowing she deserved the truth. He looked down at his hands, taking a steadying breath. "I don't know if I'll ever have a full answer to that," he began, his voice laced with regret. "I thought I was doing it for Nicholas, for Catherine, for our family. I convinced myself that by building the company, by making a name, I could give us a better life." He shook his head, the old justifications feeling hollow now. "But I was wrong. I was blinded by ambition, by this drive to be more, to have more. I pushed people away, including Nicholas. And by the time I realized how much it was costing me, it was too late." Rosie listened, her expression softening as he spoke, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes that he couldn't ignore. "You know, when I was a kid, I would have done anything just to have one day with a family like that, to feel like I belonged somewhere. Maybe that's why it's so hard for me to understand why you'd risk it all." He nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "I understand that now," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I lost sight of what really mattered. And because of that, I lost the chance to know you, to know Nicholas. I see that now, clearer than I ever have." They sat in silence, both absorbing the complexity of the past and the fragile peace they were trying to build in the present. Rosie sighed, breaking the silence. "Well," she said softly, "at least now we have the chance to be family. It may not be perfect, but it's real. And I want that, Alexander. I think I always have." Hearing this, Alexander felt a rush of gratitude. He reached out, his hand trembling as he took hers once more. "Then we'll take it one day at a time, Rosie. Whatever it takes. I'm here." Over the following days, their relationship continued to grow, the tension easing little by little. Rosie began to share more about her dreams, her struggles, her fears, and Alexander found himself listening with a patience he hadn't known he was capable of. He encouraged her, offering to help support her music in any way he could, and Rosie began to see a side of him that was earnest, generous, a man she could imagine calling family. One afternoon, as they walked along the park's winding path, Rosie looked over at him, her expression thoughtful. "Alexander, would you want to come see me play sometime? There's a small concert hall I play at every now and then, just a local thing." The invitation took him by surprise, but he felt a surge of pride at the thought. "I would be honored, Rosie. I'd like nothing more." For Rosie, it was a step toward letting him in, toward seeing if the man beside her could truly be part of her life. And for Alexander, it was a chance to stand beside his granddaughter, to witness her talent, her passion. A chance to finally be the family he had once failed to be. The day of the performance arrived, and Alexander arrived early, sitting alone in the small audience, his heart pounding with anticipation. When Rosie stepped onto the stage, her face lit by the warm glow of the stage lights, he felt a wave of emotion that he hadn't experienced in years. She looked radiant, confident, and as her bow touched the strings, the first notes filled the room with a beauty that left him breathless. She played with a grace and intensity that took him back to his memories of Nicholas, but this time, he felt no regret, only pride, only gratitude. He watched every movement, every expression, realizing that this was his family, his legacy. Not the fortune he had built, not the power he had once craved, but this young woman, standing before him, sharing her soul through music. When the concert ended, Rosie spotted him in the crowd, and a smile broke across her face, genuine and unguarded. As he rose to meet her, he felt as if the years of distance between them had faded, leaving only the bond they had built, fragile but enduring. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady. "Thank you for letting me be here, Rosie. I couldn't be prouder." As they left the hall together, Alexander felt the weight of years of regret finally lifting, replaced by a deep sense of peace he had thought was beyond his reach. It wasn't a perfect family, and there were still wounds to heal, but it was theirs. And for Alexander, it was enough. Alexander took a deep breath, steadying himself as he looked into Rosie's eyes. The truth he was about to share felt unbearably heavy, and yet, he knew he could no longer hide it. His days of concealing pain and pretending to be stronger than he was had to end. Rosie was family, and she deserved to know the reality he was facing. They were seated in a small, secluded corner of her favorite cafe, a cozy place lined with bookshelves and scattered with soft, worn armchairs. Through the window, autumn leaves drifted lazily, casting golden light across the table. Rosie sipped her coffee, oblivious to the tension building within him. Alexander studied her, marveling at the lightness she brought with her, the openness she wore on her face. A quality so rare, and one he had spent his life sacrificing for hollow pursuits. Finally, he gathered his courage. "Rosie," he said softly, his voice barely audible, "there's something I've needed to tell you. Something I haven't been honest about." She looked up, her gaze meeting his with immediate concern. "What is it?" she asked, her fingers unconsciously tightening around her coffee cup. He took another deep breath, feeling the weight of the admission already pressing down on him. "A few years ago, I was diagnosed with a neurological condition. The doctors, they say it will get worse over time. I've started feeling it more lately. The weakness, the tremors, the confusion." Rosie's face fell, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. "You've known this whole time?" she whispered, her voice catching. "I didn't know how to tell you," he admitted, his hands shaking as he reached for his water glass. I thought I had more time to figure it out, to be here with you without the burden of this news hanging over us. But it's getting harder to hide, and you deserve the truth. You've been alone so much, Rosie. I didn't want to add to that." She looked down, blinking quickly to hold back tears. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air felt thick with emotion, with unspoken fears and painful memories. Finally, Rosie drew a shaky breath, her hands clenching and unclenching as she absorbed his words. "You should have told me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've lost so much time already, Alexander. I can't believe you kept this from me. I don't want to lose you, too." Alexander's heart clenched. Seeing her in pain felt like a punishment, a consequence he had unknowingly earned through years of misplaced priorities. "Rosie, I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting you, but I can see now that I was only protecting myself from facing it. I don't want to hide anymore, not from you. I want these days we have together to be real, however long they last." Rosie reached across the table, covering his trembling hand with hers. Her gaze softened, and he saw in her eyes a strength that was startling, a fierce determination. "We'll face this together," she said, her voice firm despite the pain in it. "You don't have to carry this alone. You're my family, Alexander. We're family, and family doesn't walk away." Her words struck something deep inside him, and he felt the beginning of tears in his own eyes. She was right. Family didn't walk away, and he wouldn't allow himself to repeat his mistakes. He couldn't change the past, but he could make sure that Rosie never faced a single day of this alone. They lingered in the cafe, talking about his diagnosis, about what the future might hold. She asked him questions with a quiet, steady resolve, her voice unwavering as she probed into the details of his condition, the symptoms he might face. Alexander answered her as best as he could, though he could see the worry clouding her gaze. He explained the uncertainty of the illness, how each day could be different, and how he had yet to come to terms with what it meant for his own future. When they finally left the cafe, Rosie slipped her arm around his, walking closely beside him as they strolled through the park, their favorite path bathed in the warm glow of the afternoon sun. As they walked, Alexander found himself opening up to her in a way he hadn't done with anyone before. He spoke of the fears that kept him awake at night, the dread of losing his mind and body to something he couldn't control. And to his surprise, Rosie listened with an openness that reassured him, that reminded him he didn't have to bear this alone. Over the coming weeks, Alexander noticed how Rosie subtly adjusted her life to spend more time with him. She began to visit him at his home, showing up with fresh groceries, cooking simple meals they could share, keeping him company on quiet evenings when his hands were too unsteady to hold a book or pour a glass of water. She didn't say much about it, and he never asked, but her presence became a steady comfort, a reminder that he wasn't walking this path alone. One day, as they sat together in his study, surrounded by old family photos and mementos of the life he had once thought defined him, Rosie brought up something that had been on her mind. "Alexander," she began, her voice tentative, "would you let me record you talking about the family? About Nicholas, about Grandma Catherine, even about your career? Just so that I can keep it, so I don't forget any of it." He looked at her, touched by the request. "You really want to hear all that?" She nodded, smiling gently. "I do. There's so much about our family I don't know, and I want to remember every bit of it. You're the only one who can tell me those stories." With a quiet nod, he agreed, and over the next few weeks, they spent hours recording their conversations. He told her about his own childhood, about meeting Catherine and the early days of his business. He opened up about Nicholas's childhood, the joyful moments and the ones marked by his own failures as a father. Rosie listened with a quiet patience, asking questions, her eyes glistening at the stories of the family she'd never known. Through these stories, they built something real, a bridge across the years, across the distance that had once separated them. Alexander found himself sharing things he had never spoken about, and Rosie began to fill in the gaps of her own life, adding memories of her father that had been half-formed, incomplete. One evening, after hours of talking, Alexander felt a familiar weariness settle over him. Rosie noticed and gently suggested he get some rest. As he leaned back, closing his eyes, he felt her place a soft hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Alexander, for letting me be a part of this, for trusting me with all of it." He reached up, covering her hand with his own, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. "Thank you, Rosie. You've given me a reason to keep going, something I didn't think I'd find again." As she left that evening, he watched her disappear down the hallway, a warmth in his heart that sustained him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that each day might bring new challenges, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. Rosie was his family, his lifeline, and in her strength, he found a resilience he hadn't felt in years. When he closed his eyes that night, Alexander felt a quiet peace settle over him. For the first time in a long, long time, he wasn't haunted by regrets or the fear of what lay ahead. He was simply grateful, content to live each moment as it came, knowing that he was no longer alone in this journey. Rosie would be there with him, just as he would be there for her, bound by the strength of a family they had both longed for and finally found in each other. Months passed, each one marking a season of unexpected closeness between Alexander and Rosie. They had become family in ways that went beyond shared blood and memories, each leaning on the other as they filled the voids left by a lifetime of loneliness. Alexander's health continued to decline, as the doctors had warned it would, but with Rosie by his side, he felt a strength he had never known before. She had become his anchor, his reason to face each day, even as his body and mind slowly betrayed him. As winter approached, Alexander realized he had something important he wanted to do for Rosie, something to leave behind as a sign of his love and gratitude. Sitting in his study one chilly evening, he looked over his life's work, the empire he had built and, at one time, been willing to sacrifice everything for. None of it had ever brought him the fulfillment he felt now, watching his granddaughter grow into the person she was meant to be. And in that moment, he knew what he wanted to do. The next morning, he invited Rosie to his home, asking her to bring her violin. She arrived, curious, but Alexander only gave her a mysterious smile as he led her into his office. Sitting across from her, He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He could see the concern in her eyes, but he gave her a reassuring nod, trying to ease the worry. "Rosie," he began, his voice softer than usual, "I've spent most of my life chasing success, and for a long time, I thought that was all there was, building something grand, something powerful. But I see now how empty that pursuit was. I had to lose everything before I understood what really matters." He looked at her, his gaze warm, filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "I see now that the most valuable legacy I can leave isn't Donovan Industries or any amount of wealth. It's you." Rosie's eyes softened, and she looked down, momentarily overwhelmed. "Alexander, you don't have to say that, but it's true," he insisted gently. "And it's why I want you to have everything I've built. All of it. The company, the estate, my resources. It's all yours, Rosie. Use it to build a future that matters to you, to help others if you choose, or to support your music. Just promise me one thing." She stared at him in stunned silence, unable to fully grasp the weight of his words. You're leaving everything to me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his expression unwavering. "Yes, I want you to have the freedom I never gave myself, to choose your path, to make mistakes, to succeed, to create something beautiful in this world. You don't have to be like me, Rosie. In fact, I hope you won't be. Just live in a way that makes you proud, that would have made your father proud." Tears filled her eyes, and she reached for his hand, her grip firm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know if I deserve all this, but I promise I'll do my best to honor it, to make something good out of it, and to remember you for everything you've given me." They shared a quiet smile, and Alexander felt a peace settle over him, knowing he had done something right, something that could, in some small way, make up for the years of distance and neglect. He knew he would not be around forever, but he felt content, ready to let go of the ambition that had once ruled his life, happy to leave everything to Rosie, whose future mattered far more than any legacy he could build. That evening, they moved to the music room. Rosie took out her violin, and Alexander settled into an armchair by the fire, listening as she began to play. Her music filled the room with a haunting beauty that wrapped around him, each note filled with longing, with hope, with the bittersweet memories they had built together. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to be carried by the melody, feeling as though he were finally at peace. The weeks that followed brought moments of tenderness and closeness that Alexander would carry with him to the end. Rosie came by nearly every day, filling the house with laughter and warmth. They spent hours talking, revisiting old memories, and dreaming up new ones, even as Alexander's health continued its slow, inevitable decline. And each time they parted, Alexander could feel a quiet sadness, knowing that their days together were numbered. One snowy evening, as Christmas approached, Rosie arrived with a small, wrapped package. She handed it to Alexander, her smile filled with excitement. He opened it slowly, revealing an old, beautifully bound book of poetry. Alexander looked up, confused but touched. "Open to the first page," she urged, her eyes shining. Inside the cover, she had written a dedication. "To my grandfather, my friend, and my family. Thank you for teaching me to forgive, for showing me that it's never too late to find love and hope. I will carry your memory with me always." Alexander felt a tear slip down his cheek as he read the words. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Rosie, I don't know what to say. Just say that you'll be here with me for a while longer," she whispered, her voice filled with a gentle plea. He smiled, squeezing her hand. "I will, for as long as I can, Rosie. I promise." In the following days, Alexander felt his strength fading, but he was content. He knew that he was loved, that he was forgiven, and that he had given Rosie something meaningful. His only wish was that he could see her future, to witness the life she would create for herself. But he took comfort in the knowledge that she would carry on his memory, that she would remember the lessons they had shared. One morning, as the winter sun rose over the snowy landscape outside his window, Alexander closed his eyes, feeling a deep calm wash over him. He could hear Rosie's violin in his mind, the soft, lingering notes carrying him forward, comforting him as he drifted peacefully into sleep, leaving behind a legacy built not on wealth, but on love, forgiveness, and family. Rosie stood beside his bed, her eyes filled with quiet sorrow, but also with the resilience he had come to admire. She held his hand, whispering a soft goodbye, and vowed to carry his memory forward, to live the life he had dreamed of for her. Alexander Donovan was gone, but in Rosie, his legacy lived on. She would honor his memory, cherishing the lessons he had left behind, and as she walked out into the world, she knew she carried a part of him with her, forever. Years passed, and with them, the memories of Alexander Donovan settled into the deepest parts of Rosie's heart, becoming a quiet, steady presence she carried with her everywhere. His absence left an ache that time couldn't quite heal, but his memory guided her, like a compass pointing true north. With the inheritance Alexander had left, Rosie rebuilt her life, each decision shaped by the legacy of forgiveness and love he had entrusted to her. She left the Donovan estate, unable to bear the echoing silence of its grand, empty halls. She sold the mansion, channeling the proceeds into causes Alexander would have been proud to support: initiatives for music education, scholarships for young musicians, and programs for underserved communities. She knew that, in his last days, he had dreamed of a different kind of legacy, and she devoted herself to bringing that dream to life. But the most profound way she honored him was through her music. Rosie's career blossomed over the years, and soon, she began performing in venues larger than she had ever imagined, her talent recognized far beyond the small stages where she had once played alone. Yet, no matter how grand the theater, how esteemed the audience, Rosie never forgot the intimate joy of those afternoons spent with Alexander, playing her violin while he listened, a silent but steadfast supporter. One evening, after years of growth and quiet successes, Rosie prepared to step onto the stage of a prestigious concert hall in New York City. The hall was filled with hundreds of people, but Rosie's mind was elsewhere, her thoughts wandering back to the small bench in Central Park where she had first met the man who would become her grandfather in every way that mattered. She could almost feel him there, his presence like a gentle whisper reminding her that he was still with her, still watching, still proud. As she tuned her violin, Rosie felt a sudden urge to play something she had once played for Alexander. The piece wasn't part of her program that evening, but in that moment, she knew she wanted to honor him with the music they had shared. She approached the microphone, addressing the audience with a steady voice. "Tonight, before we begin, I'd like to play something very close to my heart," she said, her voice carrying a hint of emotion. "This is a piece I used to play for someone I loved dearly, someone who taught me that family can be found in unexpected places and that it's never too late to find forgiveness." The audience sat in silence, her words creating an intimate, reverent atmosphere in the vast concert hall. Rosie lifted her bow, and as she began to play, she poured her heart into every note, feeling Alexander's presence more strongly than ever. The melody swelled, filling the hall with a bittersweet harmony that seemed to hold all the love, pain, and gratitude she felt for him. The music was tender and haunting, each note carrying the weight of memories, of unspoken words, and of the deep bond they had shared. When the piece ended, a quiet stillness filled the room, followed by a wave of applause that rose like a warm embrace. Rosie bowed, but her thoughts remained with Alexander, grateful for everything he had given her and for the journey they had shared. After the performance, Rosie returned to her dressing room, where she found a single red rose waiting on the table. It was a simple flower, a small but poignant reminder of the pendant she still wore around her neck, the same pendant her father had left her, and the one Alexander had recognized as a symbol of their family's love. She picked up the rose, feeling a familiar warmth settle over her. In her heart, she knew that Alexander's influence would be with her for the rest of her life, guiding her through moments of doubt, encouraging her during times of struggle, reminding her to live fully and generously. In the years that followed, Rosie continued to honor his memory, not just through her music, but in the way she chose to live her life, with compassion, with humility, and with an open heart. She became a mentor to young musicians, offering them guidance, just as Alexander had once done for her. And though she never told them the full story, they could sense that her kindness was born of something deep, a love that transcended time and loss. On quiet afternoons, Rosie would sometimes return to Central Park, sitting on the same bench where it had all begun. She would close her eyes, letting the sounds of the park wash over her, and in those moments, she felt as if Alexander was sitting beside her, a steady presence she would carry forever. His memory was no longer a source of pain, but of comfort, a reminder that love could heal even the deepest wounds, that family could be found in the most unexpected places, and that redemption, however late, was always possible. And so, Rosie's life became a testament to the lessons Alexander had taught her in those final years. In her music, in her work, and in the quiet strength she shared with others, she carried forward the legacy of a man who had once been lost, but who had found his way back to love and family before the end. Alexander Donovan's story did not end with his passing. It lived on in Rosie's heart, a legacy of forgiveness and love that would echo through generations, a reminder that even the most broken lives could find healing, even the most distant souls could find their way home.